Okay, thanks to Eliyav for this it's a fascinating presentation, and I think obviously the connection between the presentations is interesting, and also the connection to contemporary questions. So we have now about 20 minutes for discussion, for questions, answers, comments. So the floor is open for those of you who want to go first. Yes, Sam.
These were terrific. Jim, one question for each of you. Jim, yours was masterful, but I wanted to ask about like a paradox that might ensue from your brilliant reinterpretation, which is that if you agree that the era in which Jews most successfully present one of their causes as a matter of international human rights is in the 70s in connection with the Soviet Jews campaign, on your account, the history of Jewish human rights is already long over.
Right.
So I just would like you to reflect on how that paradox can obtain and what it suggests. I love the other paper, but I just wonder if I could defend Lauterpacht just in one little respect, which is that in paragraph 8, you do see something very interesting relative to the Israeli Declaration of Independence. I agree with you that the priority in both documents is on the right of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state like all the other nations. But there is a comment here which goes far beyond the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which is that there could be an international rights treaty coming, and this is important. Obviously, you know this, but it's worth mentioning that in this year of 1948, Herr Lauterpacht was very bitterly disappointed by the Universal Declaration, and his response to it is to look back at the UN Charter and say it as little as human rights figure in it, at least it's binding treaty law to which states have bound themselves as a matter of law, unlike in the Universal Declaration. And so what he's saying in paragraph 8 is that this treaty will have to be implemented in any Israeli law, or should be implemented, and if there's a further covenant, as there is now, it should be implemented in Israeli law. So in a way, he goes a lot further, I think, in that statement than he gave credit for. Question mark.
Any Gil?
Some question for Jim. Thanks also for a wonderful paper. Question is about the kind of the longue durée view that you take to this issue, because I wonder if you're looking at two traditions from the 19th century and 1905, a nationalist and an anti-nationalist liberal tradition, or a liberal nationalist and an anti-national liberal tradition. The question is, do you think they remain two distinct traditions throughout this period that you could kind of put aside so easily, or are there points in which they kind of intermingle and change? Is World War I transformative in any way in making, for instance, Allianz closer to nationalism? Right. Is World War II in its aftermath, where you have people like Robinson in the World Jewish Congress that are also nationalists, but also kind of at the forefront of using the international system? So how do you kind of put these traditions together, and where do they change over like the long period?
Sure. Okay.
Go ahead.
Should we take this? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I'll start with Gil. Yeah, I think there are points of convergence, and strange things happen that some of the actors are themselves surprised about. So in 1945, at the founding conference of the UN, basically these two groups make a deal. And the deal is that the World Jewish Congress and Zionist organizations with them tell the liberals, if you agree to help us on statehood, or basically on the issue of trusts and mandates and keeping the Arab political agenda off of the UN agenda, we'll support you on your human rights aims, because we have our own investment in this, enough to go with it. So, and the American Jewish Committee, which has just bitterly fought for a couple of years against many of the Zionist positions, says sure. So there are those things, and I think it gets much easier after 1948. What's interesting to see is why, and my argument is it gets much easier for anti-nationalist liberals, because suddenly there is a state which claims the space of Jewish nationality. In fact, however much American Jews must famously, protest that Ben Gurion keeps telling us we're not legitimate, we should move here, it makes their lives easier because he says, this is where Jews are as a category, and you there are just, our supporters or whatever you are, So I think it makes it easier for them, and that's why they can actually begin to support American military aid to Israel. Not military at that point, but they can support, American foreign policy for Israel, even as they continue to fight at the UN about what minority rights and here I think Laura's right. The afterlife of minority rights into human rights discourses. They're still fighting about this, right? Throughout the 50s into the 60s, even though they've come to both accept Israel for what it is. So very briefly, Sam. Thank you. Yeah, of course. That's the weak spot is about the question was suddenly as human rights goes global, Soviet Jewry goes global as an issue of attracting attention. I would say what's key to remember is these groups exit. I mean, they literally shut down their institutions at the UN that are engaged in human rights lobbying. They farm those responsibilities out to other NGOs. The AJC, actually, what it does in the 70s is help create ACRI, right? They help create civil rights, human rights in Israel, which is a recognition that maybe they should be focused on that instead of the UN. But I think the other key thing is I would argue that what happens is they're only making one rights claim. It's not about protecting Jews inside the Soviet Union for individual rights of freedom of expression or cultural rights. It's the right to leave. And they sometimes will say that's the human right, the only human right. But I think it means something different. I think it means just emigrationism is something that actually has a lot more to do with, before World War II as a political and rescue strategy. And finally, the key thing is I view it as part of the Cold War at that point, that they turn to American power and they say, we may make global appeals to conscience about Soviet Jews, and we may speak to France, and we may speak to the UK, but really we talk to Washington, and we want Washington to, either to raise this issue or to strike a deal, and we work through states, and we don't work through international legal mechanisms to do that.
Just before passing to Liav, just on this point, another thing that can be researched is what happened to those discourse when some of those people come to Israel.
Yes.
And they become not very big advocates of human rights. And I remember that Sharansky was one of the, so when he was here, and I was on the board of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and some of the people, then he was Minister of Interior, which had to deal with a lot of human rights issues, and some people, some of the staff, lawyers went to meet him, and he said, yeah, when I was in the Soviet Union, then Sakharov was my hero and human rights, but I see in Israel it's very politicized, so I keep myself away from this, so anything to, he wouldn't adopt human rights politics here at all, quite the opposite actually. Liav, you wanted to...
Sure. Thanks. I don't need, no need to defend Lauterbach. Of course, no need to stress that he's a trailblazer in international human rights. I look at paragraph 8. Paragraph 8 is the big reconciliation. You can imagine him writing all of this and then saying, okay, but I'm still a cosmopolitan lawyer, and now in paragraph 8 I'm going to just put all, just spill out my cosmopolitan agenda. But then, I can ask you, so why did he refrain from, actually, if you look at the partition plan, it says the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of Assumption of Power, I don't remember the correct phrase, requires actually, making a declaration about constitutional rights. He could have done that. Why did he decide only to mention this future treaty? And that's a good question. But I think that that this is exactly the middle way he chose in this draft, and this is exactly the swing. He was trying to, maybe insert human rights through the back door, and this is exactly, I think, what makes it unconvincing. If he really wanted human rights, he could have just made the constitutional declaration that was required in the partition plan. But of course, no need to defend Lauterbach beyond that.
Wait. And after that, we'll take both of you. So Willie, first.
I too thought these were wonderful papers, and the way in which Eliav weaves in sort of individual biography into Auerbach's thought and alongside of the sort of broader politics and competing poles of international lawyering. It was wonderful. My comment/question, though, is for Jim. And it strikes me that, and if I get this part of Jim's story right, he underscores the ambiguity of minority rights as a feature of the moment, the kind of interwar moment. But I think at another level, the sort of ambiguity is intrinsic to rights discourse, and that so much of what can be articulated as a group right can also be articulated as an individual right. And that's not distinctive to the interwar moment, it's distinctive to legal discourse. And that the shift to an individual conception in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s on, I think I might periodize it somewhat differently, at least insofar as one is trying to understand and periodize more precisely the language of that sort of American rivals, and the ways in which I would say they in some ways come together, right? It's because when the American Jewish Congress first appears, and Brandeis is their sort of megaphone, their loudspeaker, and generally they are talking about minority rights and meaning group rights, it's because everyone knows that the old constitutional order in the U.S. will eventually have to change. That laissez-faire, or what we sometimes call Lochner constitutionalism, classic liberal constitutionalism, is so thin and impoverished and oppressive that the forces that are pushing for something new will eventually topple it. But it's still underdetermined what the new order will look like, and progressives, who some of whom have no interest in cultural pluralism and minority rights understood as group rights, nevertheless expect group rights may be part of the new order. And that is something Brandeis is channeling. But what is the so what? What are the stakes? Why does one want to hold that open? What cannot be achieved through individual rights? Because what eventually happens is Jews get what they want in the way of both individual and group rights, right, now using them just as conventional terms, without state-enforced, sort of constitutionally enshrined group rights. Because to put it very much too schematically, the community can afford to underwrite all the forms of cultural autonomy anybody wants. Right? You don't know that when most Jews are dirt poor. You don't know that how deep the cultural yearnings of Jews for separate cultural institutions will be and how to pay for them in the early 20th century. The nationalists themselves said, some of them say, we're going to just assimilate, this is a transitional thing. Others say we should enshrine and sustain over time a separate cultural sphere, and maybe we'll need the state to be obliged to pay for it. We may need those kinds of group rights, who knows? Then something happens. The shorthand way is the New Deal court turns a corner and talks about discrete and insular minority rights in Caroline Products footnote 4, right, which is the shorthand for there's going to be a new order of judicially enforced constitutional rights, but surprise, it's going to be individual rights. And that footnote talks about minority rights. And it's already sort of then becomes, that's the civil rights thing. Racial, cultural pluralism will run through an individual rights regime. And by then, so I'd say by then the American Jewish Congress, by the late 30s, early 40s, it still exists. It's not like the Congress vanishes. So it still exists, and it's saying what it means to be Jewish is to champion minority rights. it is sounding like the classic liberals. They have found a common ground already then. And they know nobody at that point any longer is talking about minority. So well before your moment, they're talking about minority rights in that particular way. And the subtext is more robust forms of both governing cultural difference in a way that honors groups and distributionally assuring the wherewithal of groups isn't a Jewish problem. So that's another periodization.
If you mind, again, we'll take two, okay? Then you can address both questions like we did last time. So because time is very short already, so yeah.
I'll try to be brief. Two questions for Jim. You said at one point in your paper that the central debate in the Jewish human rights world was between those who endorsed national rights versus individual rights. And then you sort of talked about the outflow of all that after the 60s was a very sharp focus on emigration as the central problem. To my mind, I don't want to anticipate my own paper tomorrow, that just sort of deflects the problem into a new realm because there are, as you know, collective and individual versions of the immigration phenomenon, and they get played out precisely in the Soviet case with what happens after you exit the Soviet Union and you arrive in Rome or Vienna. So I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts about whether the central conflict just takes on a new guise or whether something more fundamental than that changes. And the second question is about the Anti-Genocide Convention. I'm a little hazy in the timing of all this, but my recollection is that the Anti-Genocide Convention is about imposing duties on states to intervene in cases that are officially recognized as genocide. So is it the case that the category that defines the duty to intervene has to align with the category of the rights-bearing entity, the individual versus the group? I don't see that as being a necessary connection, but you seem to take it as the mirror image, in Lemkin's thought, as mirror images.
Okay.
So, okay, great. So we have about 4 minutes, but you can still, if you need one more.
Me? Okay.
We start with you because. You had a question?
Yeah, two small questions.
Okay, let's do it. But just give it briefly, okay? Because we are.
For Jim.
The more they talk, the less I.
First of all, why was Lemkin so threatened or so terrified by the fact that there's human rights stealing in the show? Couldn't he have integrated both, especially since you said that there's different kinds of duties? And the second is basically going back to what Gil Bobin said, the longue durée perspective and how these nationalist versus liberal perspectives change over time. So to what extent was the Holocaust actually a watershed for these individuals in actually changing their perspectives?
Sure.
And last but not least, Leora.
I wonder, since both of you, I'll ask it this way. It seems to me that for Lemkin, because he spoke about group rights, there was less of an internal contradiction than for Lauterbach, who had to actually insist on keeping it secret and having led into all these contradictions. So I want to ask whether there is something easier for this for articulating Jewish rights through these group rights than because in both ways international law made them into cosmopolitan against the story. But in one way it seems that the contradiction is internal, and in the other it's externally imposed on him in order for the international law to even listen to what he's saying. Right.
Okay, we'll ask you to answer
really quickly.
Quickly, and then we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, I think that Lemkin. I think that's. Let me start with Laura's question, then I'll come back to Laura. He was paranoid because that was his personality, right? And he was a terribly disagreeable man, even though he also seems to have been trying to be a charmer. But I think it shows us what I tried to get at the very beginning, which is that he really saw it as much about ideals and reality as political competition between competing goods, partly because they had different genealogies and partly because he understood that this would, it's a competition for the attention of states and the loyalties of states to these various laws, and it just was going to be that versus this and distract people. The Holocaust, I would emphasize for him and for everybody in the story, the Holocaust just may not mean what we think about when we say the Holocaust. Jacob Robinson has a line in this period where he says, I'm tired of people discussing Jewish mass death. Jewish mass death has nothing to do with what we're doing here. It's the fact that all the other minorities are gone and we're shrunken, which means we can't talk about minorities as a whole. We're left in Europe, but we have no place to talk about these things because of that. And the real violence has been, as he said, something to the effect of the economic disruption. We've lost our place, in the system of Europe, and we've lost other things, and we've lost our allies. And then he goes on to say, apropos of what was said earlier, our real allies were the Germans, right? When we really pursue this, and now those Germans are not the same Germans. So I think that's all part of what I'm trying to get at by saying, it was very different in that period in time. For what Ben is asking about, after the USSR, I agree, it changes, but the same drama is still there, and that's why it can work so nicely for immigration here to be Zionist Aliyah, and immigration to America to be American liberalism. These people have a right to refuge, right? And we consider them political refugees. And yet when Israel tries to talk to American Jews, there's this disconnect and there's this tension about who are these people and what are they actually doing. I would say, to turn prescriptive or normative, I think many of our problems today to talk coherently about American Jews and Israel stem from the fact that there was this tension in the 70s and 80s, but nobody really used the language of nationhood to talk about it. We just used the language of, the danger zone, the goal, the shared goal of getting Jews of rescue, and then, the politicians might debate about funding and who goes where, but we just embrace those who come here and support those who go there. And now we're sort of trying to figure out what those rights claims really meant and how they actually meant totally different things. And then, we have different notions of what democracy and what nationalism means for American Jews versus over here. So I think the roots of some of the contemporary things have to do with the confusion about that. So maybe for the sake of time, I'll just say one more comment about what Willie's asking. The periodization, it's very interesting to think about that, and I agree. Something is shifting at that point in time. Many of the people in the story are European immigrants who say, we're supposed to be in the same camp as this American Jewish Congress. After all, we're parts of the same, we're Zionists, we're liberals, and we hate those other Jews, or the German, they're still called the German Jews, But they're realizing America's really weird and different. We're supposed to have a voluntarist ability to have group community here. Again, not to make him a hero, but just because he says it very pithily, Robinson says, America's a paradise for minorities, they just won't take advantage of it. And then he says, and the reason is because this is the quote, extreme liberalism is killing them off. So that's his thing, is liberalism is not value neutral in this context. And as it's being framed more and more as an individualist right to groupness, what that really is doing is effacing the possibility for, the group rights that could allow you to have things, which is another way of saying the playing field isn't level if you don't have a formal way to create communal resources to promote language or something like that, which is a big issue we talk about, continually. So, but you're right. I think it is a fascinating encounter because American legal social thought is changing at that moment. Maybe not in the same way as international law, but with its own drama about rights.
Quick, Liora, let's assume a counterfactual that Lauterbach would have wrote in 1940-something, a book about collective rights, all right? I don't think that would solve the problem, because in order for that to be convincing, you would have to base it on some kind of an objective system of why people are entitled to collective rights. And then he would write the declaration and he would say, well, the Jews have collective rights. What about the collective rights of the Arabs, right? So he would again have this problem. He would have to revert to a non-cosmopolitan way of argument if he would have not mentioned also the collective rights of the Arabs. And moreover, he would still have the tension between effectiveness and collective rights, because if collective rights come from a natural law, justice-based perception, so we still would have to justify the rights to sovereignty either on counts of fulfillment of collective rights, or his work on recognition by on account of effective control. So at the end of the day, don't think he would be saved from these contradictions if he would be coherent, if he would decide not to be coherent. So that would be something else. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to all of you for the comments. We are going to be convening 5 o'clock downstairs at the lecture hall for Sam's keynote. And in this room only back tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. So you have a break of 40 minutes until 5 o'clock. It's downstairs in the ground floor. If you don't know the way, ask one of the locals. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Great paper. Thank you for that.